Question number 4. Grant Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance. Does he stand by his statement in the House yesterday that, quote, there is no evidence that inequality in New Zealand is increasing, end quote? If so, how does he explain Statistics New Zealand's statement this week, quote, between 2003 and 2010, the survey of family income and employment found that the top 10% had an average 55% of total net worth over this time. For the year ended June 2015, the top 10% owned around 60% of total net worth.
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, yes. Statistics New Zealand's latest estimate is that around 50% of total household net worth is held by 10% of households, and that's the same as reported in 2003-2004 in Statistics New Zealand's survey of family income and employment. Mr. Speaker, I would also add that Statistics New Zealand makes the point that comparing the two surveys should be done very carefully because they are very different.
Supplementary question, Mr.
Supplementary
Speaker.
question, Grant Robertson.
Can he confirm that the Statistics New Zealand report released this week says at the bottom of page 4, the top 10% of individuals accounted for 60% of net worth compared with the average of 55% between 2003 and 2010?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, I can confirm two things for the member. That he is trying to talk about individual wealth distribution. I'm talking about household net worth. That was the basis in which the Minister of Finance made his comments on the radio this morning. The member is right, but he is also right to note that household wealth distribution has not changed over that 12 or 13-year period. Not households, it hasn't. That's individuals, Grant.
Supplementary question, Jami-Lee Ross.
What else did Statistics New Zealand say about comparing the latest data on wealth distribution, which was collected as part of the Household Economic Survey, with old data on wealth distribution,
bring the question to a conclusion,
which was collected as part of the Survey of Family Income and Employment Survey?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, in the same report, Statistics New Zealand said, and I quote, methodological differences between the Household Savings Survey, the Survey of Family Income and Employment, and the Household Economic Survey mean the three surveys are not directly comparable. Differences include questionnaire structure, subject population, and the breadth and depth of questions. We advise caution in any comparison customers make between the surveys, and that's possibly advice for the member opposite.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Is he saying that a report prepared by Statistics New Zealand that says in bold on page 4, individual net worth is more concentrated, is statistically invalid?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, I'm not saying it. Statistics New Zealand is advising caution. I just read out what they said in the same report about comparing the two surveys. The member may not like it, but he can't selectively quote a report and not be prepared to read the rest of it.
Supplementary question.
Order. I'll just wait until we get a bit of assistance. Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Is the government doing all it can to support low-income people?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, the government is doing everything it can to assist low-income people, and on top of that, it is addressing the issue of wealth distribution by the most important way in which you can do that, which is by providing more opportunities for New Zealanders to succeed, to get high-value jobs and to bring up their families, which is why we are focused on building skills in New Zealand, on providing new access to markets for our companies, and also encouraging investment in New Zealand. That provides jobs, which provides opportunities.
Well, the question was answered at the start.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
What was he referring to in his interview on Morning Report this morning when he used the term, quote, confiscating people's assets in relation to addressing inequality?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, I'm sorry I'm not privy to exactly what the context was of that particular quote.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, Good answer. Robertson.
Mr Speaker, I was going to take the opportunity to raise this point of order at the end of question time today, but given that answer by the Minister, I'm going to raise it now. 8 of the 12 questions that are set down today, the ministers are not present to answer. I think, Mr Speaker, we have a problem with the integrity of question time. Ministers should be prioritising their attendance at question time, and when we have 8 of 12 questions unable to be answered by the Minister, we're going to get answers like that one.
Order. For a long time, it's been practice in this parliament, and I recall it when I was an opposition member on that side, that particularly on a Thursday, ministers might be away. I note the member refers to 8 questions not being able to be addressed by the appropriate minister. A number of those are particularly to one minister, the Minister of Finance. It is just not possible for a government to insist that every minister is available for every question time, and I think the convention, for as long as I've been in the House, would acknowledge that.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, Chris.
Mr Speaker, I'd like to ask you to give some consideration to a Speaker's ruling that would apply for the remainder of the Parliament, that would require the government by 9 o'clock on any given morning that the House is sitting to furnish the opposition with a list of ministers that will be available for question time. Because I think this is a fair point, Mr Speaker, because...
This is a point of order that's to be heard, and it will be heard in silence.
Because then the opposition would be in a position to decide whether to ask a question of a minister they knew was not going to be present and then not be able to get an answer, or whether to ask questions of the ministers who are going to be here.
I don't need assistance on it, and I don't think it'd be appropriate to consider doing that via a Speaker's ruling. The appropriate course of action for that would be to bring forward as an alteration to standing orders. And that process, the member will be aware of, is about to kick off shortly. We'll have an opportunity. I think the member may well be on the committee. If there was a general consensus around Parliament to do that, then we'd build that into standing orders. Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Given that this week, in respect of inequality, the government has been through denial, anger, bargaining and depression, when will he move to the 5th stage of grief, acceptance of the problem, and actually do something about inequality?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, that sounded particularly autobiographical. The member is the one that's been in denial. The member is the one that's been angry. The member are the ones being grumpy. Actually, the facts of the matter say that income distribution, wealth distribution of families has not changed in households. Wealth distribution for households has not changed, and the government is in any event moving to help families with any number of initiatives, including a number that are being starting tomorrow that the members didn't want to hear opposite earlier on this afternoon.
Order. Question's been answered. Order, Sisse.
Submit question.
Order.
Submit question.
Order. I'm just trying to get some assistance from my left. Supplementary question. The Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Minister, when under national, the top 10% own 60% of the country's wealth, and the bottom 40% own 3% of this country's wealth, why doesn't he admit what abysmal, hopeless economic managers they are?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, I think the member might be wrong with his figures, but the key point is that wealth distribution in New Zealand is actually very similar to the OECD, but in terms of how you actually address that, it's about creating opportunities for New Zealanders. And that means encouraging investment, which the member hates, which means doing deals to get foreign trade, free trade agreements, which the member doesn't like. It's encouraging New Zealanders to be connected to the world, which the member doesn't like.
Order. Now the answer's getting to be too long. Order. Supplementary question, David Seymour.
Can the minister confirm that 3% of income taxpayers pay a quarter of all income tax, that 11% of income taxpayers pay half of all income tax, and that the government spends over $80 billion a year, $17,000 per citizen, or $85,000 per family of 5 every single year?
Order. Address the first part of the question. It was too long.
Well,
Mr.
Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, people who have greater income and wealth at disposal do pay more tax, and actually I believe that that's only fair, that they do. But in fact, this government, through that tax collection, provides a huge amount of support for those that need it, as we should. And importantly, we focus on creating the opportunities for people to work and bring up their families in this country through the sorts of economic policies that encourage the growth of jobs and investment. And I know the opposition doesn't want to focus on that, but that's what's important.
Oh, supplementary question, David Seymour.
Does the minister know if John Key still regards working for families as, quote, communism by stealth?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, I haven't taken that matter up with the Prime Minister in many years.
Question number 5.